1974 should have been television's golden pivot. Instead, it became a graveyard of bad decisions. Networks chased trends that were already dying. Budgets shrank while ambition inflated. What followed were shows launched with confidence and canceled with embarrassment. Tonight we begin a countdown through the 12 worst television experiments of 1974. Starting with number 12. Number 12. Kolchak, the Night Stalker. On paper, this should have been unstoppable. A hard-nosed reporter chasing monsters through America's back alleys. Horror mixed with journalism. Folklore wrapped in trenchcoat cynicism. But what worked brilliantly as a pair of TV movies collapsed under the weight of weekly television. By 1974, Kolchak was trapped. Every episode followed the same mechanical rhythm. Kolchak arrives. Authorities dismiss him. Monster kills again. Kolchak proves the truth. Authorities erase everything, reset, over and over. The formula hardened fast and viewers noticed. Behind the scenes, the show was exhausted. Tight schedules, reused sets, recycled ideas. What once felt eerie began to feel rushed. Monsters were often underlit or barely seen, not for mystery, but for budget. Scripts leaned heavily on exposition. Suspense became repetition. The biggest problem was tone. Kolchak wanted to be scary, but also witty. Serious, but episodic. It never fully committed. One week, it chased genuine horror. The next, it drifted into camp. Audiences struggled to understand what kind of show it actually was. Ratings slipped quickly. Network patience evaporated. Despite a loyal niche audience, the series was canceled after just one season. At the time, it was considered uneven, sloppy, and creatively frustrated. Only years later did its reputation grow. Writers and filmmakers would cite Kolchak as influential. But in 1974, it was seen as a misfire. A great idea that television simply did not know how to sustain. Number 11. Paper Moon. Turning a beloved film into a sitcom is always risky. Paper Moon walked straight into that trap. The movie thrived on chemistry subtlety and emotional restraint. The television version replaced all of that with canned rhythms and weekly punchlines. Set during the Great Depression, the show followed a con man and a sharp young girl drifting across America. On film, the relationship felt fragile and authentic. On television, it felt staged. Dialogue became explanatory. Emotions were spelled out. Silence was replaced by noise. But casting didn't help. While competent, the leads lacked the lived-in warmth that defined the movie. Their banter felt rehearsed rather than discovered. What once felt like survival now felt like performance. The format worked against it. Depression-era hardship was softened into sitcom hijinks. Poverty became a backdrop instead of a pressure. Moral ambiguity vanished. Every episode neatly resolved itself by the final minutes. Audiences were confused. Was this a comedy? A drama? A family show? The answer changed episode to episode. Networks promoted it poorly, unsure who it was even for. Ratings never stabilized. Critics noted how lifeless it felt compared to its source. By the end of its short run, Paper Moon became another example of Hollywood misunderstanding why something worked in the first place. But instead of expanding the story, television flattened it. The soul was gone. The road felt fake, and time quietly erased it. Number 10. Get Christy Love. This one hurts because the failure was not the idea. It was the execution. Get Christy Love arrived with cultural significance and genuine promise. A black female undercover cop as the lead was groundbreaking for network television. But the writing never rose to the moment. Episodes leaned into cliches rather than character. Plots felt thin. Dialogue leaned on slogans instead of substance. Christy Love deserved depth. Instead, she was often reduced to attitude and catchphrases. The show wanted to be tough, but played it safe. Police work was simplified. Danger rarely felt real. Moral complexity was avoided. The world around Christy felt artificial and sanitized. Production values were uneven. Some episodes looked sharp. Others felt rushed and cheap. Direction lacked consistency. Supporting characters blurred together. Critics noticed the gap immediately. They praised the concept but criticized the storytelling. Viewers tuned in out of curiosity but drifted away due to weak scripts. Despite strong promotion, the show lasted only one season. Its legacy became bittersweet, remembered not for what it achieved, but for what it could have been. In 1974, Get Christy Love was a missed opportunity, a step forward trapped inside a badly written vehicle, and television moved on before it could evolve. Number 9. Born Free arrived on television carrying the impossible weight of its own reputation. The original film had been intimate, emotional, and quietly profound. It treated nature with reverence and danger with humility. The television series stripped that away almost immediately. What remained was a formula adventure show dressed in wildlife imagery. Each episode followed predictable beats. A problem appears in the African wilderness. A moral lesson is gently explained. Order is restored before the closing credits. The raw unpredictability that made the film resonate was replaced by safety. Production realities worked against it. Shooting on location was expensive and limiting. Animal footage was reused. Danger was implied rather than felt. The wild became a backdrop instead of a living force. Even moments meant to feel tense played like educational segments. Characters suffered the most. Relationships were thinly sketched. Emotional stakes rarely escalated. Conflicts resolved too neatly. But what once felt like survival now felt like routine. Audiences sensed the downgrade quickly. Viewers expecting emotional continuity from the film felt disconnected. Younger viewers found it slow. Older viewers found it diluted. Ratings slid quietly. Critics described it as well-intentioned but bloodless. By the end of its short run, Born Free had become another example of television misunderstanding restraint. By explaining everything, it killed the mystery. By softening everything, it lost the truth. Number 8. Sierra. Sierra arrived at exactly the wrong moment. The Western had already collapsed on network television. Audiences had moved on. Sierra pretended none of that had happened. Set around a national park, the series attempted to modernize the Western by blending ranger drama with environmental themes. If the intention was respectable, the execution was lifeless. Episodes moved slowly. Conflicts felt small. Threats lacked urgency. The wilderness never felt dangerous. Characters spoke in exposition rather than emotion. Even action sequences felt restrained and careful. The show could not decide what it wanted to be. Part Western, part family drama, part nature lecture. As a result, it never developed a clear identity. Viewers tuned out quickly. Production values were uneven. Outdoor shooting added atmosphere, but not momentum. Scripts leaned heavily on moral lessons delivered without subtlety. The tension that once defined Westerns was absent. By 1974, the genre needed reinvention. Sierra offered preservation. That was not enough. Ratings collapsed early. The network quietly pulled the plug. And today, Sierra survives mostly as a footnote. Not hated, not remembered. Just another Western that arrived after the door had already closed. Number 7. The Girl with Something Extra. The Girl with Something Extra was built on a gimmick so thin it could barely survive a single episode, let alone a season. The premise centered on a woman with psychic powers trying to live a normal life while helping a magazine reporter solve problems. In theory, it promised light fantasy charm. In practice, it delivered confusion and creative exhaustion. The show never decided what kind of story it wanted to tell. Was it a romantic comedy? A supernatural mystery? A workplace sitcom? The answer shifted scene by scene. Psychic abilities appeared and disappeared based on convenience. Rules changed constantly. Stakes never formed. And comedy was the greatest casualty. Jokes relied on misunderstanding and reaction rather than character. Psychic revelations were treated like punchlines instead of engines for tension. Humor felt soft and oddly timid. Even moments meant to surprise arrived without rhythm or timing. Characters were underwritten. The lead relationship lacked spark. Supporting roles existed only to facilitate plots. Emotional beats were skipped in favor of easy resolutions. Nothing lingered. Nothing mattered. Audiences never connected. Critics described it as weightless television, neither strange enough to be memorable nor grounded enough to feel real. Ratings fell quickly. Cancellation followed without resistance. In 1974, fantasy television needed clarity. The Girl with Something Extra offered distraction without direction, or a concept without commitment. A show that floated briefly, then disappeared without leaving a ripple. Number 6. Lucas Tanner. Lucas Tanner arrived with an unusual ambition. A comedy drama about an idealistic young teacher challenging a rigid school system. It wanted to be thoughtful, progressive, and heartfelt. Unfortunately, it misunderstood its own audience. The tone was deeply conflicted. One moment the series leaned into earnest social commentary. The next it chased broad sitcom beats. Humor undercut seriousness. Seriousness crushed momentum. Episodes never found balance. The central character was written as a symbol instead of a person. Lucas Tanner represented ideals rather than emotions. He lectured more than he lived. Students existed as problems to be solved rather than individuals to connect with. The dialogue leaned heavily on speeches. Drama became instructional. Pacing dragged. Conflicts resolved predictably. Institutional resistance folded too easily. The show wanted to critique authority but refused to embrace real consequence. Every challenge reset by the next episode. Critics noted the sincerity but questioned the execution. Viewers tuned out. The show felt preachy without being powerful, gentle without being engaging. By 1974, audiences were tired of being talked at. Lucas Tanner confused intention with impact. It meant well. It failed anyway, and good intentions did not save it from quiet cancellation. Number 5. Amy Prentiss. Amy Prentiss was born from network desperation. A spin-off created not because the story demanded it, but because the schedule had a hole to fill. When spun out of Policewoman, the series attempted to capitalize on a familiar face while abandoning the structure that made her compelling in the first place. The premise followed a newly promoted female police chief, navigating internal politics and institutional resistance. On paper, this promised tension, authority, and progress. In execution, it became static television dominated by conversations rather than action. The central problem was inertia. As a chief, Amy Prentiss was removed from the street. Conflict became bureaucratic. Stakes became procedural. Episodes unfolded through meetings, disagreements, and moral discussions that rarely escalated into drama. Authority replaced urgency. Tone was cautious. The show wanted to address gender politics but avoided confrontation. Resistance was softened. Opposition folded quickly. Victories felt symbolic rather than earned. What should have been a pressure cooker became a waiting room. Pacing suffered badly. Scenes lingered without payoff. Dialogue explained issues instead of dramatizing them. Supporting characters existed to reinforce themes rather than challenge them. The city never felt dangerous. Crime became abstract. Critics noted the intentions but questioned the execution. Viewers drifted away. Ratings declined steadily. The network quietly canceled the series after a brief run. Amy Prentiss failed not because it lacked relevance, but because it lacked motion. In 1974, television demanded momentum. This show chose discussion over drama and disappeared as a result. Number 4. The Manhunter. The Manhunter arrived during a flood of crime dramas. Police procedurals dominated schedules, but to survive a show needed distinction. The Manhunter had none. Following an insurance investigator chasing criminals across the country, the series struggled to establish stakes. Crimes felt abstract. Victims were distant. Consequences rarely lingered. The lead character lacked texture. Calm, competent, and emotionally flat, he reacted rather than drove. Episodes unfolded predictably. Investigation followed formula. Resolution arrived on schedule. Production values were modest. Locations blurred together. Action was restrained. Tension was implied but rarely felt. Most damaging was pacing. Episodes dragged. Scenes lingered too long without payoff. Dialogue explained what the visuals failed to convey. Audiences tuned out quickly. Critics noted the lack of urgency. Networks lost patience. The Manhunter vanished almost immediately. Or not remembered for controversy or disaster, but for absence. It left no mark. In 1974, blending into the background was a death sentence. The Manhunter blended perfectly. Number 3, The Texas Wheelers. The Texas Wheelers was a sitcom built on a single joke, stretched far beyond its breaking point. The premise followed a loud, wealthy Texas family invading a quiet California town. Culture clash was the engine. Unfortunately, the fuel ran out almost immediately. Every episode relied on the same beats. Texans are crude, Californians are uptight, chaos ensues, resolution resets everything. There was no evolution, no escalation, just repetition delivered louder each week. The humor leaned heavily on stereotypes that already felt dated in 1974. Characters were exaggerated to the point of caricature. Subtlety was absent. Timing was sloppy. Punchlines arrived without setup. Performances were broad but not energetic. Actors seemed trapped inside the concept, unable to add dimension. Supporting characters existed only to react. No one grew. No one changed. Critics were harsh. Viewers were indifferent. Ratings collapsed quickly. The show barely lasted long enough to register. The biggest failure was tone. What might have worked as sharp satire played instead as blunt mockery. The joke felt mean-spirited rather than clever. The Texas Wheelers vanished almost instantly, not controversial enough to debate, not funny enough to remember. Just another sitcom that mistook volume for comedy. Number 2, Planet of the Apes. Few television miscalculations hurt as much as this one. Planet of the Apes had been a cinematic phenomenon. Bold ideas, the political allegory, striking visuals. The television version inherited the name and lost everything else. Budgets shrank drastically. Ape makeup looked rubbery and inconsistent. Sets felt cramped. The world that once felt alien now felt cheap. Stories repeated endlessly. Humans run. Apes chase. Moral lesson delivered. Reset. There was no narrative momentum, no deepening mythology, nothing that justified weekly viewing. The show avoided the film's darker themes. Allegory softened into surface-level morality. The bite was gone. What remained was costume drama without weight. Performances suffered under the limitations. Actors worked hard, but the material offered little room. Dialogue leaned on explanation instead of tension. Audiences tuned in out of curiosity, then tuned out quickly. Critics were brutal. And many felt the franchise had been humiliated. The cancellation came fast. Damage lingered. For years, Planet of the Apes was considered proof that some worlds should not be flattened into television schedules. In 1974, this was not just a bad show. It was brand erosion in real time. Number 1, The Magician, worst of the year. The Magician earns the number 1 position because it represents the most confused identity crisis of 1974 television. It could not decide what it was and never committed to any version long enough to work. The premise followed a wealthy illusionist using his skills to help people in trouble. Part mystery, part crime drama, part fantasy, part vanity project. The show tried to be all of them and succeeded at none. Episodes relied heavily on gimmicks. Illusions replaced investigation. Tricks substituted for tension. Rather than building suspense, the show revealed answers through spectacle. Mysteries dissolved instead of escalating. Stakes vanished behind smoke and mirrors. Tone shifted constantly. One week it played whimsical. The next it chased seriousness. Comedy undercut danger. Danger never felt real. Viewers never knew how to engage with it. The lead character was written as untouchable, confident, clever, and rarely challenged. Without vulnerability, there was no drama. Supporting characters existed only to admire or assist. Conflict evaporated on contact. Critics were dismissive. Audiences were confused. Ratings collapsed quickly. Cancellation followed without resistance. The Magician did not fail because it lacked ideas. It failed because it lacked discipline. And that is why it stands at number 1, a show that believed cleverness could replace storytelling. In 1974, television was changing. The magician stayed trapped in illusion and disappeared when the trick stopped working. 1974 wasn't just a bad year. It was a lesson. Big ideas without execution collapse fast. Brands can be damaged overnight, and television never forgives confusion. These 12 shows didn't just fail. They vanished. And sometimes that's the harshest verdict of all.